Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Jonathan Goodhand, and I'm a professor in Conflict and Development Studies in the Development Studies Department of SOAS University of London. I'll be moderating today's session, which is entitled Sri Lankan Crisis, Reasons and Resolution. Now, though we refer in the title to the Sri Lankan crisis, in reality, the country is experiencing a set of interlocking crises: financial, economic, political, developmental, and humanitarian. And of course, these crises don't affect everyone in the same way and to the same degree. But for the most vulnerable in Sri Lanka, this has literally become a battle for survival. So it's clear that Sri Lanka is experiencing a major inflection point today, but the direction of travel is unclear. There are strong demands emerging from the street and from new political coalitions for fundamental change. And at the same time, there are significant forces pushing back against such changes. So today we'll be discussing a number of questions. What's happening on the ground? What do we mean when we talk about the crisis? How is it affecting people's daily lives, as well as the wider politics and economics of the country and the region? What are the underlying reasons behind the crisis, locally, nationally, and globally? How might the crisis be managed, addressed, or resolved? And finally, to what extent are current events in Sri Lanka reflective of and linked to a broader set of crises going on in the world today? Now, to discuss these questions, we have three really excellent speakers with long and varied experience of the country. I'll introduce in the order that they're going to present today. So kicking off, we have Jayanti Lingam, who is a research fellow in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, and a member of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development. Her research focuses on feminist and critical historical approaches to the political economy of development, gender regimes, violence, and conflict. Sorry about the thunder. We're having a typically British day of varied weather here today. From 2019 to 2021, Jayanti was a co-investigator on the Monash-Warwick Alliance-funded study, Inclusive Economics, Enduring Peace, the Role of Social Reproduction, which examined the costs of social reproductive labour in Sri Lanka and Myanmar. A PhD from SOAS examined women's working lives in the post-war context of Sri Lanka's northern province. Next, we'll have Dr. Kiran Grewal, who is a reader in sociology at Goldsmith College, where she convenes the MA in Human Rights, Culture and Social Justice and co-directs the Unit for Global Justice. Kiran's current research focuses on the social justice struggles of marginalised and or subaltern groups in Sri Lanka and what they can contribute to decolonial theory and practice. She is the lead investigator on a British Academy-funded project entitled Building New Critical Democratic Communities in Sri Lanka, the Role of Traditional Arts and Ritual. And I believe that Kiran was actually in Sri Lanka when as the crisis and the demonstrations were kicking off, so she has first-hand knowledge of events on the ground. Finally, certainly not least, we have Professor Mick Moore, who is a professorial fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. He's a political economist by training. His extensive field research in Asia and Africa, especially Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and India. And for those like myself who've worked on Sri Lanka for many years, many will have read his seminal book based on his PhD research, which was entitled The State and Peasant Politics in Sri Lanka. His broad research interests are in the domestic and international dimensions of good and bad governance. He focuses specifically on taxation and governance, and between 2010 and 2020, he was the founding Chief Executive Officer of the International Centre for Tax and Development. He's now a Senior Fellow at the ICTD. So each speaker will give a short input of 5 to 8 minutes. As they're speaking, please put questions in the chat box or any other ways that you want to ask questions. And we will then, I hope, proceed to a rich and enlightening discussion. I'd like to now hand over to Jayanti.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for joining us. I wanted to start actually by expressing solidarity with everyone from Sri Lanka who's joining us here at this very challenging, difficult time. And it will be really good to hear your input as we go through the session. I'm going to, in my few minutes, give a very short overview of some of my key takes on the situation. I'm going to move on to look at some of the reasons for why this situation has arisen, looking at some key, what I see as key international dimensions, historical dimensions, and then looking at the domestic context. And then I'm going to finish by raising three questions for us to think about moving forward. So, as Jonathan said, Sri Lanka is experiencing a profound crisis, and this crisis is economic and political in nature, and giving rise to the mass protests that those of us who are not there have been watching and following in the press. And one thing that I wanted to stress is that the protests aren't just in and around the capital, Colombo, although that's what the international media has focused on. But there have been village level marches, there are demonstrations that are burgeoning, there are workers' movements, and they're very much driven by the fact that the economic situation is causing really acute everyday hardships. And as Jonathan said, working classes and the most economically marginalized are, of course, the worst affected, but this is impacting everyone. Just to give a few statistics, the huge increases in the costs of food have happened since the beginning of the year. For example, I think a kilo of rice costs something like 40% more than it did in January, but it's also double the price of what it was a year ago. Fuel is probably now, as of today, more than double what it was in January, and prices just went up today. There are severe shortages in those and other really crucial basics such as milk powder, cooking gas, medicine. This has resulted in hours-long queues for essential goods, which have resulted in several deaths as people are queuing, and energy shortages, which have led to extensive power cuts. And the two things that I want to emphasize in relation to this is that while the sort of narrative is that this is an economic crisis, economics is never just economics, it's political. So the two are really inseparable. And thinking as we look at the international and domestic dimensions, I think I'll really try and focus on what we can take as the politics of this economic situation, both at the international level and the domestic level. The second thing that I really want to stress is that this is a crisis of social reproduction. And what I mean by social reproduction is what we in political economy would call the daily and generational renewal of human life. So it reproduces us as workers, which is the basic condition necessary for further capitalist production. But it's just broadly about the reproduction of society through nourishment, through housing, through medical care. And at the moment, conditions are such that people's everyday needs in Sri Lanka are just not being met. And then there's simultaneously a knock-on on social reproductive labor, that is the work, which is usually unpaid and disproportionately undertaken by women to make sure that individuals, households, communities can stay fed, nourished, warm, and safe. And the effects of that affect people differentially according to how they're positioned in the economic and political context in Sri Lanka. So that's a very brief and selective overview of where we are. In terms of the reasons, I guess I wanted to start by really sort of pulling out some of the reasons that the likes of the IMF and the World Bank and perhaps what you might call liberal or neoliberal commentators are saying. So the focus is on government making what are called populist policy decisions around tax cuts and around agriculture, and I'll come back to these. And the government themselves say that COVID, the impact of COVID and the impact of the war in Ukraine are significant. And these have absolutely been triggering factors. So Sri Lanka is very dependent on its tourism sector. COVID and the lockdowns badly affected this, as did the 2019 Easter bombings from a year before. In terms of the war in Ukraine, in addition to the impact that it's having across the globe on all economies, Russia was a major recipient of tea, which is Sri Lanka's major export. But a key matter that I really want to raise is that broader international context. So Sri Lanka operates as a highly open, extroverted capitalist economy. So within a global capitalist system at this stage in capitalist relations, which we can call neoliberal capitalism. So that's capitalism underpinned by financial capital, where finance rules how the global economy proceeds. And since 2009 or 2010, as it moved to middle income status, Sri Lanka has become increasingly dependent on international financial markets, and particularly international bond markets, to raise money to finance its spending. And we can talk about what this spending is, and how it's been mismanaged, but it does also include spending on social programs, on education, on health, on domestic needs. And actually, whilst there's been conversation internationally about how Sri Lanka has become too dependent on Chinese debt, actually, I think it's about just over 10% of Sri Lanka's international debt is with China, and 40% is in the international sovereign bond market. And the open nature of Sri Lanka's economy means that it's especially vulnerable to international shocks, so to global price rises, to increases in interest rates. And that's what's happening now. And the reason it's political as well as economic is because it's due to the particular shape of this global capitalist economy that we live in. And this has historical dimensions as well. So Sri Lanka's relationship with the international economy needs to be understood in historical context. So going back to from the 1970s, from the late 70s, when it undertook kind of very sweeping open market reforms that were typical of capitalism of the time. And then there were domestic decisions made that were contingent upon this opening up of the economy. So the failure to invest in domestic production in the agricultural sector, and uneven development that happened across the rest of the island. Returning to the domestic dimensions then, I think this is where the focus comes in on the current regime. So anger has been very concentrated at the family dynasty of the Rajapaksas. Gotabaya has been president since the end of 2019, but the Rajapaksa family has had central political power for close to 20 years. And the populist decisions, I guess you could say, that happened since 2019 relate to the dynasty's implementation of electoral promises, so notably tax cuts in 7 areas and an abrupt switch to organic farming. And I just wanted to comment a little bit on each of these things. So on tax, Sri Lanka has a low tax take compared to its national economy. I guess that the question I think that we need to think about is, the issue is not just about how much tax comes in, it's where the tax comes from. So which sectors of society. So the 7 different tax cuts included a major cut on VAT, which we can call a very regressive tax because it doesn't target the people who have the most money, it targets everyone, so disproportionately the most vulnerable in society. But, for example, Sri Lanka gives preferential rates to export sectors, so the export processing zone. So we can question if taxes need to be raised, who should that increased raise in tax fall on? Should there be a wealth tax? Should the export process, should international investors be paying more? And then secondly, the switch to organic farming. What happened here was a ban on artificial fertilizers. Some say that this was because Sri Lanka wanted to save money on foreign exchange, so not import artificial fertilizer. I wanted to bring up a report by Verite Research in Sri Lanka, where actually they noted that farmers broadly support the principle of moving away from chemical fertilizer because there are concerns amongst populations, rural populations, about the health impact to rural populations of doing this. But farmers did at the same time warn that doing this abruptly with no support would cause a huge reduction in crops, which it has done. So there are huge issues with the way in which this policy was implemented, but it does raise questions about the extent and nature of support from the government for the agricultural sector and domestic production. And then the third thing I wanted to raise was another significant set of domestic dimensions shaping the state's relationship with society, and that's through the constitution and the political settlement. So the Rajapaksas have centralized political power, and that's enabled them to put through these changes uncontested. And part of the protesters' demands are demands for constitutional change. And I would say that those political solutions really need to take into account the uneven and unresolved political settlement that has been continuing, not just in relation to the centralization of political power, but also how it affects people across the island. So Tamil people in the north and east, Muslims, and how they relate to the state, what they want and need from the state, and what their political aspirations are. And I think this is a very significant point because it will affect the shape or the potential of the protest movement. What I want to say about protest movements before I finish on my 3 points to raise is that protest movements across the world, and ongoing and historically, are dynamic. So people say, what do the protesters want? Why haven't they decided what they wanted? Why aren't they set in their demands? Protest movements are dynamic. They don't necessarily begin and end with fixed goals, as I know that anyone who's joining us from Sri Lanka will know much better than I'm saying here. As collective struggle gathers steam, so too do popular demands. So we can see this already in the trajectory of the protests. So in March, the demonstrators started by demanding that the president resign. This has continued. There's been anger concentrated at the Rajapaksas, but there's been demands for constitutional change. The movement has really grown. Trade unions took part in a mass general strike on the 28th of April. And these current protests are part of this dynamic history of struggle for better lives on the island. So the 3 points that I wanted to end on, and I'm sorry because I know that I'm going very much over time here, is that there's huge potential for change, but the nature of that change matters. And my question would be, can real economic justice or change happen within a capitalist system? And I would say not. There's an inherent tension between a system that's set up to maximize capitalist profit and a system that's oriented to meet human needs. And we saw that during the pandemic. We're seeing it now in Sri Lanka. The second point is that the radical analyses and calls for anti-capitalist systemic change that are coming from Sri Lanka, from economists, activists in Sri Lanka and globally, need to include calls for a radical reorganization of social reproduction as well as production. And so that means reorganizing how social infrastructure is funded, how redistribution is funded that prioritizes social reproductive needs and that focuses on the needs of women who disproportionately do social reproductive labor. And then the final very key question, which I think perhaps will come up in the discussion, is how can and do the current mass demands for economic justice link to and build solidarities with much longer standing but very significant political demands for justice and accountability? So as the protests, even before the protests started in the south of the island, Tamils in the north have been protesting against the government for years and voted en masse against the Rajapaksas in 2019. And just before the demonstration started in the south, Tamil families of those who were forcibly disappeared in the war were resisting a visit by the Rajapaksas to the north. So there is potential to build solidarities, and the struggles there are absolutely economic because some of those districts in the north have the very worst poverty levels. For example, poverty across the island is maybe below 10%, although obviously seriously increasing. In Mullaitivu, in one of the most war-affected areas, it's over 40%. So there are absolutely economic needs of the masses in those war-affected areas, but there are also significant political needs, struggles to find out what's happened to disappeared and missing family members, to get back occupied land, to demilitarize, and there are significant questions around political rights and aspirations. And I would say that moving forward, there is a crucial need to kind of reach out and build solidarity and start these conversations which won't be quick and won't be easy and won't be about immediate fixes, and will be more than symbolic and will be a process rather than a few actions, but they need to happen, and they need to really be driven, I would say, by the very inspiring and encouraging protest movements that are happening in the south of the island. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jayanti. There's quite a lot of questions coming up already, so there's lots of things to pick up on there, but I'll go straight to Kiran now.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Jayanti. I think you've sort of laid set out a scene for me that I can definitely feed into, and I suppose what I'm going to share in the few moments that I will take are some reflections from the time that I was in Sri Lanka in April, which was as there was a sort of turning point in the protest movement towards kind of establishing itself, particularly, as Jayanti's mentioned, what has been reported in the international media around the Gaul face in Colombo, and the establishment of the Go to Go Home village. And similarly, there have been Go to Go Gamas that have sprung up in different parts of the country. And so I spent just a flying visit, a couple of weeks in the country at Go to Go Gama, and also a week in Batiklo, which is the area that I'm most familiar with in the country. And so I also was speaking to some friends in Sri Lanka today in preparation, asking them what would they most like people in other parts of the world to know or to take away from what's happening currently in Sri Lanka. The first thing that a number of people said to me, which very much picks up on what you were just saying, Jayanti, was that they really want to stress that this is a political crisis. It's not just an economic crisis. But they also are very keen to stress that there is no doubt that the suffering is real. People are really feeling the economic crisis in very real ways. And I witnessed that already in April, but I know it's only gotten worse. There are severe shortages of medicines. When I was there in April, the Batiklo Hospital announced that its neonatal ward had run out of tubes for newborn babies, and they were having to reuse tubing. So this is very real. And the queues for petrol, for gas, are growing. People are struggling to get more than a meal a day. So nothing that I say here denies any of the reality of the suffering. But one of the key messages that I keep hearing over and over again is also how people involved in the protest movements, which, as Jayanti has said, are not just congregated in Colombo. They're not just at the Gaul face. They are really happening across the island and at all sorts of different levels of society, that there are also real calls for this to be seen as a moment of political change, significant political change. And in fact, as one friend put it this morning, the frustration that they have right now is that the sort of recent attempts to reorder Parliament and the bringing in of Ranil Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister is an attempt to re-establish a political order that for him and for many other protesters is just untenable now. And that's where this emphasis on political crisis, I think, is really important. That, yes, as Jayanti said, the kind of focal point of the protest, what became a very easy catchphrase, was the Go to Go Home catchphrase, and then extending to the whole Rajapaksa family. But actually, the call is much broader than that. It's actually a call for a reordering of the whole political establishment, of which Ranil Wickremesinghe is very much a part. I mean, he's been Prime Minister on and off since 2001. So when he comes in suggesting that he's going to come and help sort out the problem, he has been a cause of the problem. He's been there all along. And so the emphasis amongst the protesters is that they won't be sort of fobbed off with just taking out one person and putting in someone else who is still a part of the same institutional structure. And so, as I said, while there is definitely a feeling of crisis, there is also a very strong feeling of, and certainly in April, and I think it's obviously becoming harder to sustain as life is getting harder for people, but there is still a sense that this is a moment where there is a real opportunity for political change. The crisis that we are seeing is a crisis of the institutions. It is a crisis of the financial institutions. It's a crisis of the political institutions. And there is clearly an attempt being made using all of the kind of the old tricks that political elites have used in Sri Lanka over many, many decades to try and reestablish order, whether it's through trying to stoke anti-minority feeling, as was attempted by trying to sort of scapegoat Muslim populations, which has been a tried and tested method by the Rajapaksas in recent years, but also by trying to introduce violence into the protests to justify heavy-handed police and military responses, by declaring emergencies. All of these techniques have been, and also bringing back someone like Ranil Wickremesinghe, who, in terms of the public support, just doesn't have it. I mean, he didn't even win his own seat in the last election, so he has no mandate from the people. But all of the sort of machinations happening within institutional, formal political sphere are attempting to use all of the same tricks. The protesters are saying they won't accept it, and really, to their credit, when you look at things like attempts to use the kind of classic rhetoric of Sinhala nationalism or Buddhist nationalism, it hasn't worked this time. People have really resisted that, and this, I think, is something that we really need to highlight and emphasize, that in the midst of all of this suffering and in the midst of a really difficult situation, there is actually some really positive, there are some positive developments in the Sri Lankan context, both in terms of Sri Lanka's history, but also I think things that we as people are being affected by, obviously less acute, but similar crises in our political and economic institutions all over the world, can also draw inspiration from. So, I mean, one of the things to say, first of all, is, and Professor Yuan Goda, who is a prominent left public intellectual who's been very active in the political scene in Sri Lanka for many decades, made the point at the inaugural session of the People's University. So this was an initiative set up at Kota Gogama to represent sort of a space for sharing in ideas and to sort of promote some sort of deep intellectual debate about the situation. Professor Yuan Goda spoke and said he was blown away by what was happening in Sri Lanka, that since he's been involved both as an observer and a participant in the political scene since the 1971 uprisings, and he would never have believed that the level of mobilization without a recourse to violence would be possible. And I think that's one of the overarching messages that I've heard from friends who've been involved in JVP politics, friends who have been involved in various parts of the Tamil struggle, that everyone has been so amazed by the ways in which protests have been possible and organized in ways that just have not drawn on violence, and in fact have actively rejected the use of violence. And I say this, one of my first observations in April of being back in the country after 2 years out because of COVID was it was truly inspiring to see the dignity with which Sri Lankan people are handling the current crisis, and not just the dignity that they're showing in the ways in which they are handling the queues that they have to experience, the shortages that they have to experience, but the ways in which they have organized themselves in their protest movements. And this, I think, on the one hand, it's a credit to the people, and it also has really highlighted just how broken the state and the state responses are, because what we've seen is pretty much every time there has been any kind of violence in relation to any of the protests, it's been instigated by political figures themselves and or been the result of police and other security forces actively trying to stoke violence. It's not been on the part of the ordinary protesters. So I think that's really important to highlight. But the other thing that, and this was something that we discussed at the People's University in April, the other thing that I think is really important about that is it's a really big crack in the dominant rhetoric that the state has been able to mobilize. Not just the state, political elites on all sides have been able to mobilize, which is this idea that, you know, if there is not a firm hand, if the state is not authoritarian in some way, that there will be chaos, there will be anarchy, and anarchy will result in destruction. And so that fear that people have had, which has led them to support authoritarian and repressive regimes, the protest movement has dispelled that myth completely. Because actually what we've seen is that in a protest movement that does not have one center, it has not been organized or led by any one group, and that has been really very spontaneous, that actually the first things that they did when they created protest sites was to set up libraries and healthcare tents and spaces for children to play. And as I said, you know, violence has not been in any way a part of the narrative of what the protests should involve. So I think that is a really important thing to stress. The other thing I think that is really important to stress about the ways that the protests have been happening in Sri Lanka, and this connects to what I was just saying, the fact that there hasn't been one leadership or one message has actually been probably one of the biggest successes of the protest movement so far. You know, on the one hand, there is, of course, a fear that if there is not some sort of organization or some sort of channeling of demands, that, you know, it will dissipate, or that you know, real progress can't be made. But I mean, I think Jayanthi sort of mentioned this, that actually allowing the protest movements to not have one center, not just geographically. So as Jayanthi was saying, the protests have not just been in Colombo, they've been across the island, but also not being dominated by any one particular political voice or agenda, has meant that a lot of things that have been happening on the peripheries for decades, again in Sri Lanka, but that have always been on the peripheries and had very little space allowed to them, have now been able to actually speak and connect to each other. So, you know, this is not to romanticize all of the very real divisions that exist in Sri Lanka. And I mean, one of the critiques of some of the reporting of the protest movement, and sometimes the ways in which the protest movement is sort of conveyed, has been, you know, a focus on unity and harmony. And anyone who's spent any time in Sri Lanka knows that you know, all the wishful thinking in the world does not make that a reality, and certainly not until, as Jayanthi already pointed to, you know, certain historic questions are reckoned with, certain material injustices are addressed. But I do think that within the protest movement, there are a lot of people who really recognize that. And, you know, it is a credit to the protest movement that you can simultaneously have, you know, a little tent establish itself, which is for war heroes and veterans, and next to it you can have a tent that is for families of the disappeared. It's a tension, and it is a real tension, and it's certainly not easily reconciled. But the fact that there is that possibility of a space that can be occupied by many different actors, recognizing that the power dynamics within that are shifting and changing constantly, but the fact that there has been that space has also been incredibly important. And I think that that's reflected in what we've seen earlier on this month with the commemoration of the end of the war, where for the first time in Colombo, there was actually some sort of ceremony recognizing the final stages of the war and what happened in Mulivaikal. But also, even prior to that, in April already, we saw posters of journalists that have been disappeared by the regime, not just this regime, but past regimes as well, being put up on the walls of the presidential secretariat. We saw a recognition of war crimes and then being named in Colombo, which, you know, I can't stress enough to people how important it is that that has actually happened. So it's certainly not a neat, simple, utopian experience of being in these protest movements, but I think that it is really important to recognize that certain things are being spoken that were not able to be spoken before, and certain connections are being made. And the last point that I'll make on that is, in the process of those connections being made and attempts, and I think one of the challenges is trying to figure out for this protest movement, what if the current political language, political framework, symbols are the problem, what would a new political language look like? What would that new framework be? And that's certainly, you know, it's a struggle. It's something that is requiring a lot of work, but there is a lot of work going into it right now, a lot of creative work. And so the last thing I'll say is, I think it's really important for us to highlight some of that work that's happening. And it may not be on the mass scale, it may not be at this sort of big macro level, but the local initiatives that we are seeing all across the country are important. One, because they are providing really important sources of communal support, and also humanitarian aid in many circumstances. So it is about survival needs, but also some of these local initiatives are actually going beyond just survival. They're actually trying to model alternative ways in which we might think about community, the alternative ways in which we might think about future economic possibilities and future political possibilities. And so I think that one of the things that we as observers really need to do is pay attention to those little initiatives and not let them get drowned out in the process of, you know, the reestablishment of certain master narratives about A, what the problem is, and B, what the solution should be. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Kiran. I'm delighted to say Mick has joined us now. So I'll hand straight over to Mick. If we can keep within 10 minutes max, Mick, then we'll have a bit of time for questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. My apologies for my earlier absence. Let me start by making a connection to what Kiran just said. She's absolutely right. This protest movement is just incredible. One couldn't have imagined it happening in Sri Lanka, given all the recent history. One dimension of this, which is relevant to what I want to say later, is this was virtually united front across almost any social and economic sector you can imagine, including the private sector. That is, in particular, the chambers of commerce, the organized business sector, but also some individual companies. The private sector has kept very quiet for the last 10, 15 years because, like other parts of Sri Lankan society, it had been told very clearly by the government that they did not want any public criticism at all from the private sector. That gradually began to change a few months ago, and at the point where the demonstrations and the popular movement started, the private sector was also almost in full voice, complaining publicly and basically asking the government to go. So there was a very united front. That is no longer quite the case. And I can get later to talking about why it's not the case. But let me go back a little bit to the economic origins of this crisis, because it's related. I think it's useful, Jonathan, to start by saying there are two conventional, quite common explanations of this crisis in the media, which are significantly misleading and mostly wrong. And the first one, actually this does relate to a question that I believe is coming up, is the role of China. And it is not unusual to see a story that says in some way this is the result of Chinese government policy, of the Chinese government capturing the government of Sri Lanka and making too many loans, etc., etc. Well, that is almost entirely wrong. It's true that China is a significant creditor to the government of Sri Lanka, but so is India, and so is Japan, and so is the Asian Development Bank, and so are lots of private bondholders. China is not a particularly significant creditor. Neither has China lent money to Sri Lanka at extortionate rates of interest or forced loans on the government of Sri Lanka. So that is just a red herring. The other account, which is not quite as misleading, but also seriously misleading, is the idea that Sri Lanka is just the first of a whole series of low-income countries that have run into economic problems because of the sequence of COVID-19 and then the current very high cost of fuel and food internationally. In other words, the view that Sri Lanka, it's just another case of a poor, relatively dependent economy being hit by forces beyond its control. Now, that is not the case at all. This is the most man-made, and these are men, economic crisis, national economic crisis that I ever remember seeing. The economic crisis has been predictable for at least a year. People have been warning about this for at least a year, and the government has been completely deaf about this, could have taken action long ago to prevent getting into this crisis. I'm going to make, before I explain that in detail, I'll just make one comment. There is actually a slight positive side to this, not for people in Sri Lanka at the moment, unfortunately, who are fully the victims of this, but for other countries and other places. Even the most corrupt and undemocratic and vicious government sometimes actually ends up shooting itself in the foot and destroying the basis of its own power. And this is what the Rajapaksas have done here. So let me explain briefly how they did this. It is a little bit of basic economics, but it's actually not that complicated. Some years ago, the Rajapaksa, well, governments of Sri Lanka in general, started to borrow money internationally, not just from the institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank or governments, but also from private bond markets. And they were borrowing this money principally because they were investing a lot in very large scale infrastructure projects, ports and roads and all that kind of thing. And borrowing for that is not intrinsically a bad thing. But if you borrow money internationally, you need to be able to repay. And after the general election in 2019, which the government won, winning almost 2/3 of seats in parliament, the government, which was already collecting quite a low level of revenue, considering Sri Lanka's wealth and income and economic growth, decided that in its budget at the end of 2019, it would not collect in the next financial year about 30% of the government revenue from taxes that it would otherwise collect. It was a tax giveaway. It's party time. Have your money back, virtually. Now, when the people who held the commercial international bonds from Sri Lanka saw this, they started to get worried because they realized that the government of Sri Lanka's capacity actually to repay its loans was now in question. So in response, they were no longer willing to lend to Sri Lanka at the same rates of interest as before, but they were effectively only willing to lend at higher rates of interest. And at that point, the government of Sri Lanka could have done two things that would be sensible. One is it could have just restored the tax cuts, and because the tax collection level is anyway very low, this would not have done great harm. Or it could have dialed back a bit on the level of investment so it didn't need to borrow as much. It did neither of those things. It just borrowed more money at higher rates of interest. So it was borrowing money at higher and higher rates of interest in order to repay previous loans. And about a year ago, quite a number of people began to cry, crisis, crisis. We are about to go over a cliff. At that point, the government of Sri Lanka could simply have gone to its creditors, international creditors in the bond markets, and said, sorry, we have overborrowed. We cannot possibly repay this money on schedule, and you can see that we can't, and so we need to reschedule. That is not, it's a little bit tricky in the details, but I mean, that's a perfectly respectable, legitimate thing that countries do. It's the same way as individual borrowers do from banks. But the government of Sri Lanka decided that somehow it was a matter of great honor and principle to say that they could repay all their loans. So they carried on repaying, and the government imports most of the fertilizer, a lot of the food, most of the fuel, etc. And so it started to cut back on the imports of these other things, fertilizer, fuel, and food, just in the interest of repaying its bondholders. And it was in fact then that the private sector started to become more and more outspoken, because there are plenty of people in the private sector who could see the idiocy of this strategy. But the government carried on doing that until about 2 months ago. And finally, when the treasury was virtually empty and had been close to empty for a very long time, and when the imports of food, fuel, and fertilizer had been really cut back, at that point, the government finally admitted that its economic strategy was completely wrong, and said that it can't repay its loans, and then everything kind of hit together. This admission that the economic strategy was wrong, the need to go very urgently to the IMF to get some more loans before the economy would really ground to a halt, and then the popular response that we've heard about. So the current crisis it's a political crisis, but it's an economic crisis at the same time. The two are very deeply interwoven. And if we're talking about the problem with the solutions, this is exactly this interwovenness of the political and the economic.
Thanks very much, Mick. Thank you. I think now we only have a short time left, but I think we've had an incredibly rich overview of the different dimensions of these interlocking crises. I mean, the key message that's come out from all the speakers is about the intersection of the political and the economic, and you can't understand it without understanding how these different dimensions come together. But I think in the last few minutes, it would be good to kind of spend a bit more time reflecting on what the resolution might look like. I mean, we heard some quite optimistic as well as some very pessimistic views about the nature of this crisis, but also the response to it. And it'd be interesting to have some final reflections, perhaps going in reverse order. So from Mick to Kiran, then to Jayanti. About what you see the resolution, how it might look. And there are some questions that have been asked, which we might kind of weave into this. And there's particular interest in the regional dimensions of this crisis. China's been mentioned in several of the questions. I think Mick has dealt with that to an extent, but might want to expand upon this. Hambantota Port has been mentioned as an example. There is also a question about the role of the diaspora. So if it's okay with you, Mick, to go back to you to give a few reflections on the resolution and weaving in any kind of responses to those other questions, and then we'll go to Kiran and Jayanti.
Yes. I mean, I think we're still on a knife edge. Anything could happen. We're not on quite such a knife edge as we have been last week or the week before, when literally almost anything seemed possible. There is now a government. They are appointing ministers very rapidly. The government has finally got round to appointing the economic and legal specialists it needs to negotiate with the IMF. Quite a lot of progress has been made in reaching an agreement with the IMF. The first thing I think I should say is that there is quite a strong consensus, a policy consensus in Sri Lanka, that any new economic policy is going to have to involve some very significant program of direct cash transfers to the poor people who are being really hit by this program. I haven't heard a single economic policymaker or indeed politician in Colombo disagree with that. And in fact, the Prime Minister said that recently. And that's important because many people have a view of that when the IMF comes in, the IMF just cuts public expenditure, chop, chop, chop. And some of the preemptive reaction to the IMF is based on the idea that the IMF is going to do that. Well, in fact, in this case, the IMF knows full well the problem in Sri Lanka is not low public expenditure, it's low taxation. So the emphasis is going to be on raising revenue, not on cutting public expenditure. That's already too low. I mean, the IMF knows it's too low. Even so, it's going to be very hard to get anywhere near a balanced budget. But I think what we're probably going to see in the immediate future is the current government is going to consolidate slightly. It will probably do a deal with the IMF. And if that goes ahead, there is the possibility that the government could be in power for some period of time, that they will pass legislation that will reverse a lot of constitutional changes, reduce the power of the president considerably, possibly even abolish the executive presidency. So that's one possible way forward, but that's not a great way forward because most of the popular opposition are not happy with that. They want the Rajapaksas out and they want the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe out. So I think the short answer to the big question, Jonathan, is that there is no easy resolution to this. And we have quite a range of scenarios, and even the kind of most plausible one that I mentioned is far from guaranteed and is going to make a lot of people very, very understandably very unhappy.
Thanks, mate. Not a particularly optimistic prognosis. But should we go on to Kiran? Over to you.
Yes, I'm not sure that I can add optimism here. I mean, except to say, I mean, I think certainly conversations I've had with friends who are involved in left political parties, I think one of the problems that they the two problems they had was, one, they didn't expect the level of uprising that there has been, and so they didn't really know how to capitalize on it when it happened. And two, I think anyone sort of stepping in now into the fray feels like they're taking up a poison chalice. So I think there is, at the level of the sort of the political parties, I think that is going to continue to be the case. But I think, I mean, this is what I was sort of trying to say at the end, was I think, there's been a lot of debate in Sri Lanka about, okay, so IMF is bad, but then what? And then nobody knows, well, what else can we suggest? And I think, and maybe this is just, the way I approach things, but I think paying attention to some of the local initiatives that are saying, actually the alternatives can't be debated at that level. What we actually need to focus on is small scale and sustainable alternatives at the community level. And the bigger picture will take time, and it will play out whichever way it does. And so I think, ideas about sustainable food production processes and the ways in which communities are organizing, particularly in rural parts of the country, are probably sources of more hope and inspiration right now than the kind of big institutional level. And just, in terms of the knock-on effect for the region, I mean, I think one of the things that is really interesting that is emerging in Sri Lanka is exactly this recognition that actually, even though, you know, we still have this narrative of we need to go to the international community, the international community has to intervene. I think Sri Lanka has learnt the hard way, and certainly the Tamil community has learnt the hard way, that actually the international community won't save you. And so as a result, I think that there is a lot more of a turning inwards to recognizing we need to self-organize and we need to look after ourselves, and also maybe at the level of those sort of grassroots initiatives, then there is a reaching out to other parts of Asia as well to say, actually, you know, the sort of struggles that we're involved with are also the struggles that, you know, fishing communities in South India face, you know, peasants in Nepal face, you know, so I think that there are ways in which this might be an opportunity for a kind of a more, you know, subaltern form of cosmopolitan organizing, separate to the kind of the macro level attempts to understand what's going to happen to the region.
Thanks very much, Kiran. I'll go straight on to Jayanti and see if we'd like to squeeze in some final thoughts from everyone in a second. So over to you, Jayanti.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. I'll try to keep it quick and maybe just more comment on a couple of the things that Kieran and Mick have said. I would agree very much with Kieran that I think change needs to come from below, if you can make those distinctions, from the people, from the movement below, as opposed to being imposed on from above. The real change is going to happen that way. I think there is a limit to which it can just be community based. It will at some stage come into tension with what's happening, you know, what's being imposed. But those tensions, you know, will move things forward. I agree very much with Kieran that the emerging movement can make connections with movements across the South Asian region, but globally also. So that the amazing inspirational Hartel, the union, the general strike that was happening, you know, we and unions in the UK across the world need to be making connections. We need to be, and this perhaps also plays into the question about what can diaspora communities do. The Sri Lankan diaspora is not monolithic, definitely not monolithic. Even the Tamil diaspora isn't. But we need to be thinking in those ways. I'm afraid I don't share Mick's view on the IMF and on. I mean, I think that this crisis, I think, was actually pointed out by Sri Lankan economists even well before the Rajapaksas came in. So it was brewing then. I have no sympathy for the Sri Lankan government as it is. Let me just say straight out, but I'm not convinced that they would have had success in renegotiating with international lenders. You know, Greece didn't manage it. I'm not sure Sri Lanka would have managed it. I think that sorry, I've lost my thread now. Yeah, I think the change isn't going to come from internationally. I do also think that there are questions about the domestic settlement, how it plays out. So as Kieran said, the international community won't save you. So we need to turn inwards definitely for Tamil communities or certain parts of Tamil communities. There are serious questions about what those domestic resolutions could look like, given the failure of earlier domestic resolutions. So that needs to be thought about. The final thing I really want to end on is a question of anger, which I think people are very typically quite uncomfortable about thinking about. I think we need to be comfortable with and okay with people being angry for lots of different reasons. We need to be okay about saying people are really angry about the situation that's going on at the moment without being sensationalist, because I think anger can be a really productive move for change. We need to be okay with the fact that there will be tensions between communities on the island because of historical anger, and work through that in the hope of getting towards an emancipatory solution. So sorry, that's a bit of an abrupt ending, but
If I can ask if the organizer is okay with us go just 5 minutes over, because the three things that inputs just there are really, really interesting, and I want to give an opportunity to people to respond to each other. And you know, the scenario that Mick mapped out there, there's a lot of friction between that scenario and what Kiran is talking about, and also what Jay is touching upon. In many ways, the new elite settlement it's still the old elites who are desperately organizing to re-establish some kind of settlement that doesn't really deal with the sources of the anger. And I just want, so any kind of final reflections from the three of you in response to what you just heard about how you see this playing out over the next, let's say, the next year. Mick, do you want to make any final thoughts there? Just putting you on the spot.
No, I mean, I am virtually sure that whatever happens in 2 months' time will be quite different from anything we envisage at this moment, because this is really a very fast evolving situation. Any possibility is there. I think we cannot dismiss the possibility that the military get more involved in government. And I would say that so far, the military have been less assertive in getting involved in this than I think most of us feared. There is a very clear sense at various levels the military have backed off because they realize that this is a very, very explosive situation, and it could really get out of hand. So not at this moment, I think talking of, if not exactly a military government, a more militaristic government is premature. But it's one of those things that might happen if we get polarization. And we have polarization now because, in effect, the private sector is going to go along with the current government, and the government is responding very quickly. And frankly, in terms of economic management, the new government is doing the things you'd expect of good technocrats. They're quite impressive. The problem is they just do not have that much legitimacy. That's the real tension we have here. It's on the one hand, a reasonable degree of competence in the circumstances, as opposed to a quite low level of legitimacy.
Sorry, Jeff.
Yes, I'm just conscious of the fact that somebody in their comments has asked us to answer some of the questions. So Mia, apologies for that. I actually, if I can go through some of them and make some brief comments. You asked what kind of leadership is required to get through this crisis. I hope a little bit, Kiran responded saying that leadership really needs to come from the movement as it is. I wanted to add on to that and perhaps direct people to an amazing article by Jodie Dean that was specifically about Occupy Wall Street. Again, a very different context, but back in 2011. But it's called After the Anarchist Moment, and it really kind of pushes thinking about how that very horizontal and necessary kind of leaderless protest, which is necessary at the beginning to bring people in, can then evolve into something that can actually bring about material and emancipatory and progressive change. So I would say that's where the protest movement could potentially look at going to actually kind of move forward. Just looking at some of the other, Janet Barth asked, what impact could this all have on the insurgency? Is it still brewing in Sri Lanka? And I think maybe this relates a little bit back to Jonathan's point about is the elite settlement, if it continues with things as is, what kind of a change is that going to make? I guess I would maybe cite Jonathan, if that doesn't sound too obsequious, in looking some of his research, looking at what happened after the tsunami, which was a point of crisis and a point of potential progressive change, actually, because the same settlement came to bear on the circumstances. What happened was that existing tensions kind of became exacerbated, and that crisis was almost like a lightning rod, I think Jonathan and his co-researchers said, to exacerbate tensions. And I would really say, and I don't mean this in a sensationalist way, but I would say that unless those deeper and long-standing political issues are addressed and the conversations are had, however difficult, then there is a risk of of those tensions becoming exacerbated. I don't mean that the Tamil insurgency is going to return. I mean, that's absolutely not what I'm saying. That's not a possibility. But I would say those tensions will continue and potentially deepen unless those questions are addressed. Sorry, I don't want to take over anymore, so I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on any of those questions.
Kiran, do you want to come in?
Well, just to say, and this sort of picks up on some of the questions that Mia's raised, and someone else asked the question about what the diaspora can do. I mean, I would say, and what international actors can do, I would say my main plea would be that we not, in our attempts to be helpful, we don't try and impose any particular order on what is the very difficult, messy process that people in Sri Lanka are trying to work through politically, picking up exactly on what you're talking about, Jayanthi, that, you know, these very difficult conversations that need to happen and are starting to happen. We need, I think the best thing we can do is to try and help out in terms of, you know, humanitarian aid where possible. And there are certainly organizations that are, you know, organizing to help with medical supplies and things. And I think, you know, with the solidarity that Jayanthi expressed at the beginning, but to also make sure that we don't try and over determine what is possible out of this moment. And I, in order to exactly have the kind of messy working through process that people know that they have to go through there, and that Jayanthi, you're saying, is absolutely necessary for this to be not just something that then replays itself in a couple of years' time.
I would say I would absolutely agree that it's messy, Kiran. I would say that there are ways forward that, without imposing or without coming in from above, that we can think about that might be that need to be more organized, or that the movement needs to evolve into, in order for it to remain a people's movement and something that's really emancipatory. Senan in the comments has said, why can't we learn from the Argentinian example? And actually, maybe I think that is a really interesting point. There's an Argentinian economist, Corina Rodriguez, who published a piece recently following on from a webinar with the Social Scientists Association in Sri Lanka, talking about how the crisis in Argentina at the turn of the century, which obviously had differences, gave rise to this very vibrant and dynamic grassroots movement of people, of different groups of feminists. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. But there are also differences in terms of the role of the military and the role of people's relationship with the long-standing political protests. So in Argentina, there was a kind of widespread acceptance of the issues of families of the disappeared, and the military was not seen as having legitimacy in any part of the country. Although I know Mick said that the military has really been very cautious, I would say that the military, you know, still isn't cautious in the north of the country, you know, and hasn't been for the past 13 years, and it's heavily militarized, and everybody there knows that the military will get violent there and has, you know, legitimacy to be violent. So I think those are questions to think about as well. But I would say the Argentinian example could be a really inspiring one to think about and learn from in relation to some of the things that Kiran brought up.
Thanks very much, Jayanthi. I think we need to finish off now. I'm sorry if we haven't managed to answer all of the questions. We have covered a lot of ground, though, and I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I think the discussion has revolved in many ways a lot more around the reasons rather than the resolutions, and I think that's unsurprising. What the discussion has done is really unpack the multiple kind of dimensions and layers to this thing that we're calling a crisis, and the resolution, in some ways, it's a moving target because it's constantly changing. But I'd like to say thank you very much to Mick, to Jayanthi, and to Kiran for really sharing some really interesting insights. I suppose the thing to finishing off is to say that we're thinking, all of us have a lot of friends in Sri Lanka, and we're thinking we're in solidarity with people who are going through a really difficult time at the moment, and it's something we should stay engaged with and in solidarity with people there. So thank you very much, and thank you to Lavina, Open Forum, and hope to see you in other events. Bye, everybody.